Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett, and this week on the Midweek Roundup, we're going to be taking a look at 3 questions we've been hearing from international educators over the past 7 days. And as we do each week, we take our stories for our Midweek Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays on about 9 a.m. Eastern. And if you would like to subscribe to that newsletter, I'm dropping some links into the chat on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel, but we'll also be putting them in after the recording to our Twitter and LinkedIn feeds for this event. So the newsletter is called All the SMIE News Fit to Share. And we put it out each Monday in 2 forms, one which you could subscribe to directly from our website. That's smieconsulting.org/subscribe. And you'll also find ways to subscribe to this podcast as well as to the newsletter if you choose. But we also put this out on LinkedIn. So if you're following me on LinkedIn, you can certainly get that direct to your LinkedIn feed each Monday morning as well. So we do that as a way to help generate the kind of set the stage for what we cover here on the Roundup every Wednesday by focusing on both social media and international education stories that have come across our desk in the last few days, and then we consolidate that in the newsletter and give our quick takes, hot takes on those news stories, and then go in depth into 3 of those stories each week, 3 of those themes we see developing in news stories here on the Roundup. So we'll get right into our questions of the day. First up, why are visa backlogs happening in major markets? Now, if you're following and certainly most of us who are on the international admissions side of things are eagerly awaiting our new incoming classes. If they haven't already arrived on campus, orientations are going on this week. Arrivals are happening soon. Classes begin next week or in the next couple of weeks. So it's a hive of activity, and I know many of you won't be watching live. You'll be watching on repeat or downloading the podcast. But this topic of visa delays is coming at perhaps the worst time. Earlier in the summer, we did see quite a bit of news on how visa delays, particularly in a country like India, were being actually reduced. We saw, and one of the recent articles we shared last week said that there was only a 10-day wait for a student visa appointment in Mumbai. But apparently there's now a 480-day wait in New Delhi and Hyderabad. So there's some real challenges, and as we've gotten closer to the start of this academic year, we've seen those delays worsening. And this is at a time when in India in particular, the number 2 source country for international students in the U.S., we've seen a lot of reports over the year so far that as of up until mid-May, the consulates and embassy in India had issued more F1 visas than they had done pre-pandemic in the same time pre-pandemic in 2019. So which was a decent year for the U.S. and India. So we see in India, up until now we've seen a lot of positive news coming out about visa appointments and the focus on student visas in particular. But the data is certainly turning in India and some other key markets, is certainly turning against that early success at a time when it's really crunch time for many institutions hoping to bring in that class. A class that in many respects is potentially 3 classes in one over what might have been coming in 2020 that had spent the last 2 years overseas, maybe starting their degree or postponing their degree and then coming in for the first time this fall. For students who were trying to do the same thing in fall of 21, couldn't get their visas in time. And then, of course, a new cohort of applicants from the past academic year that have graduated from their secondary schools or their undergraduate institutions and are now looking for graduate programs in the United States. That's potentially 3 years of backlog that most consulates and embassies have been trying to sort through. So in one respect, it's increased demand that we've been seeing. And in India, certainly, there's been data on a number of different fronts to suggest that clearly the U.S. is booming now in terms of interest in India. But there are also markets where it's not going as well, where there are not significant delays. We'll talk about that in another moment or two. But the national or the average, according to Cato Institute's report, that shows that U.S. visa processing has now reached their worst point since the post 9/11 attacks. Obviously, that's fairly significant for anyone who's been in the business that long. You remember post 9/11, everything was on hold for months. And that visa processing basically ground to a halt. You weren't getting in the spring, unless you met coming from some very friendly countries. That we're now at a point where the average tourist visa wait time, this is a global average, is 247 days. And that's compared to a benchmark of 17 days before COVID. And we've seen that for student interviews, that are averaging now 49 days globally as of July 2022, 5 times the pre-pandemic average of 10 days. So clearly, the State Department's still grappling with these issues. And frankly, I'm not surprised, but I'm frankly disappointed. When this is a question I had the opportunity to, a friendly question I actually asked at the EdUSA forum of the Consular Affairs staff that were presenting at the final panel of the day, of the event. And I said, hey, we've all experienced the Great Resignation. Higher ed certainly has. Most of U.S. society has. Globally, there's been that. And we know it has impacted State Department folks, in not only those based in D.C., but those Foreign Service officers out in the field. There have been departures from the ranks of the consular officers that haven't been replaced. There's been a combination of reasons for that. I suggested that it's been in-country host countries' requirements for reentry if they had left the country, for how many could stay, limits that were placed in certain countries. But even given that opportunity to acknowledge, hey, we realize you're in tough straits here and you're doing your best to get back to where you were, they said, no, we haven't experienced that significant of staffing shortages. And it's really folly when you hear government officials speaking like that. That makes you wonder. We're on your side. We're on the same team. We want this to work. But they've had real challenges, and the data certainly supports this, that they're losing ground this summer in major markets, India being the most particular. I think the troubling thing when you see an average wait for tourist or business visas is that's an astonishing 247 days compared to the pre-COVID 17 days. That is worrying for anyone who's looking to come to conferences in the next 6 months or a year. So if you want to come to the U.S. and you don't have for NAFSA next year or any other major conferences, and if you don't already have a visa, you may want to look into applying now for that. It's a very tough environment, frankly, and a very depressing one from the State Department and the U.S. higher ed side to see these delays resurfacing. Even though, I mean, they are still prioritizing student visas, and we have to give them that. That is, but 49 days at this time of the year is not ideal. It puts most students beyond the entry point for this fall term for most institutions, other than those that might be on a quarter system that start in late September, early October. But you're encouraging a further pushing back of interest or starts in the United States. That may force some of those students to again continue their degrees online, to start their degrees online this fall, and then make the shift hopefully in the spring. So it's not the best situation for U.S. institutions and certainly for the students that have been trying to get here. But it's a complicated mix, and this ISEF Monitor report that I've dropped the link in the chat to certainly paints a fairly accurate picture, obviously with the data that they're showing. You also see an example of some of the more hyperbolic but very accurate reporting being done in India that focuses on that 500-plus day wait for U.S. visa appointments for Indians. But they balance this with they are seeing similar delays for UK and other Schengen countries in Europe in terms of travel there. So it looks like many consulates in India, in particular, the U.S. and other Western powers and European powers, are experiencing these similar delays. So we'll see if how long this continues. But in a major market like India, there's huge demand to go out, not just to the U.S., but to Canada, UK, Australia again. So we'll see if these delays continue in the coming months. But the one area where we are not seeing this happen, and wait times in China, for example, are nowhere near what other countries are facing. And to give you a sampling of what that is, I think the last one I saw for Beijing is only 2 days. Bangkok, 7 days. Ho Chi Minh, 6 days. So that's good news for applicants who are looking to come this fall in Vietnam, Thailand, or China. But not so good in Bangladesh, 551 days, Istanbul, 428, Abu Dhabi, 310. And that's for student visas. So some real challenges there. Maybe you can get through emergency appointments, but reality is there's still a lot of holes in U.S. embassies around the world. So where there is less wait in Vietnam, Bangkok, China, you see maybe that's not as significant a demand in terms of student flows. We don't know until we see the yearly data, which we won't get that for some time yet. But why is China not seeing significant delays? Well, I think any of us who've been in international ed for the last 6-7 years have certainly seen this decline had started back in 2015 for many institutions, where the numbers of Chinese undergraduates in particular started to decline. We saw a continuation of that decline during the Trump years, and during the pandemic it was kind of a double whammy. Had Trump issues, and then China's response to the pandemic has also been a contributing factor, students not being able to get out. So Newsmax has done a report on this, as has Foreign Affairs, so I'll be posting the links to those stories that will answer the second question we have today. How should U.S. universities respond to Chinese students? And this is looking at this in a couple different ways, not Foreign Affairs. The second article is from Forbes. But they both address the issue of Chinese student visas, how we've seen the decline in the United States for several years now. We're seeing not only a combination of government policies in the United States and government policies in China. We're seeing issues with how obviously in the United States, with the rise of, during the pandemic especially, we saw the rise of anti-Asian hate and acts of violence against Asian Americans and Chinese and other Asian immigrants to this country or students in this country. We saw that. It happened. So there's no way around that question that it actually happened or not. But what we have seen is a slow erosion of that. We still, even though most of the rest of the world has come out of the pandemic, there are still significant travel restrictions in China. Students are being told not to travel in a lot of cases. So as a result, the number of Chinese student visas issued this year compared to pre-pandemic levels dropped more than 50%. And that's worrying. We were seeing 5, 10, 15% declines in new students or overall Chinese students over the last 5 years. But the number of visas issued being lower, 50% lower than they were pre-pandemic, at a time when most other markets are reemerging and reawakening and sending more students again, like we've seen in India. You're seeing this as a real worrying sign of what's to come. But they are still the number one source country for the United States for international students. We are losing ground, though, amongst Chinese students who are looking at college education. The UK is cleaning up those students that might have come to us in the last couple of years. They've been taking them in droves. They're going to be well over 35% of their total international students will be from China as of after this fall's intake, I'm sure. But we're seeing the significant numbers at large flagship institutions in the United States where Chinese students have started to fall even before the pandemic, from highs of at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where there were 1,200 Chinese students. They've seen a 66% drop through last fall, 2021, in just 5 years, and they expect their numbers to be down or slightly or flat this fall. So Indiana University, for example, one of the major top 20 institutions for receiving international students, they have dropped over half in 6 years, almost 7 years, from a high of 1,600. It's over 3,200, about 3,200 in 2015. They're down to 1,600 in the spring of 22. So what it has had is it's an overall cumulative effect of messaging from the U.S. pre the current administration, but also the trade wars or the Asian hates, the gun violence. All of these things are factors that impact not just Chinese students, but in particular, they've been acute victims of it in terms of how their interest in coming to the U.S. has been damaged significantly. So the questions of safety that during the pandemic especially were impacted. So the question is, what do you do? What can you do? And the Newsmax report obviously doesn't answer that part of it. But what I am going to share with the Forbes piece is particularly addressing the positives, and that's why I always like to focus here on the Roundup is focus on what are the positives, what are some of the examples of what institutions are doing to counter these negative trends that we're seeing. We shared over this Forbes article shares the same data from the drop in F1 student visas issued in the first 6 months at 31,000 compared to 64,000 in the first 6 months of 2019 pre-COVID. So 3 years ago, it's dropped 50%. It raises concerns against institutions that have been reliant on Chinese students. I'm working for an institution now that China is their number one source for undergraduate and graduate students. So there's a real worry about what that's going to look like, how much they will be impacted by that longer term. But it's a bottom line thing for many institutions. It's also part of a larger trend we saw during the Trump years and enhanced by the pandemic in terms of a drop of international students. So what can you do? And do you just toss your hands up and give up and just down tools and go all virtual and not travel anywhere, or what is the answer? So there's in addition to the obvious facts that right now for U.S. or any recruiter from any country to try and go to China to meet face-to-face with students and parents to reassure them in person, it's very difficult because any institution that wants to send somebody that doesn't already have an on-campus rep or has permission to live in China, they face 10-day quarantine where they have to pay their own way before they can leave the hotel to then do their business and then return. So it's a little bit dodgy. I mean, most institutions don't have budget to have somebody sit in a hotel room in China for 10 days before they can actually do work in terms of direct recruitment. So it's interesting to see what will happen, because as China's refused to relax and open as much as the rest of the world has, they also are preventing a lot of their own students from going abroad. They're talking against travel, other than to certain approved markets, it looks like. So what are U.S. institutions doing? Part of the examples this Forbes article talks about, they look at that. Though the good news is for this fall, there has been an increase. Almost 2/3 of institutions in a spring survey reported an increase in applications from international students for this coming academic year. That's up from the 43% reporting an increase a year ago. We're now looking the prospects for a full recovery are a little bit more murky in terms of whether that's actually going to happen. Some campuses, and we'll show a couple examples here in a minute in our final question of the day, some campuses are being creative and finding ways to diversify and to reach other markets. But when it comes to China in particular, we face a lot of different barriers that we just outlined. We face the impact of the pandemic. We face the impact of Trump policies and the lingering after effects of that, the anti-Asian hate that came up during the pandemic especially. We also face competition, like I mentioned, from the UK, that the Chinese students are flocking there in numbers that they've never done before. We now see our costs are becoming more prohibitive for more of the Chinese market, as we've seen in recent weeks, the articles about the U.S. dollar strengthening and the impact that's having on international students' ability to come to the U.S. So there's the other added cost that we have here, and that's even though the quality is still there, even though the prospects for jobs after graduation are still there, and career boost and all the other networking things that drive students to the U.S. and the campus experience is better than anywhere else. Those aren't enough of a counterbalance now in a lot of different markets. China is certainly one of them. So the challenge is, as we all know, the over-dependence on China is difficult to replace. It's just there isn't another China out there, no matter how bad we look. Anyone who has even a cursory glance of population charts around the world knows that after India and China, there's no one even close to a population to support those kind of numbers. After China and India, we're the next most populous country here in the U.S. Then it's Indonesia, then Brazil, then perhaps Nigeria and some other countries. So we're talking about where the next China is going to be. It's not going to be any one. It's probably going to be a mix of 5 or 6 or 10 that are going to have to replace those numbers. But the point isn't that, yes, we all know we need to diversify. Yes, we know we need to look at other markets, but we also need to we don't want to say, and we should never say, no to any particular market, particularly when it's your number one market. That's cutting your nose off to spite your face. Now, in terms of what you can do, there has to be a renewed emphasis, as the Forbes article points out, on direct in-person international recruitment. And where you can't, that's ways that you have to leverage your current students' experiences to share why they still feel they're getting good value for money, why they're having a positive experiences, why they're not experiencing all the things that they'd heard about and were cautioned about in terms of looking at the United States. So we have there's been a rise in the need for mental health care support for students that are coming from countries that it's not a thing to have mental health issues. But I think the pandemic certainly made us all realize how fragile our own personal well-being can be when we're thrust into a lockdown for months on end, depending on where they're coming from. So there's ways that you can help your international students, current students, make sure that you're serving them effectively in every aspect of their lives on campus, that you're capturing their stories and sharing them back out to your prospective students. So we'll see if it works with China. I don't know if it will 100%. We're not going back to those peak days in the mid-teens, 20 teens, when we had 300,000 Chinese plus. I doubt we'll ever get back to that with such an over-reliance on particularly Chinese undergraduates to drive a lot of campuses' international populations. So we'll see where we go, but we can't ignore that market because it's always going to be there. There's nothing comparable that's ever happened in terms of international student flows to the U.S. Where a country would just be purposefully shut out, except for Iran after the Iran hostage crisis in 79 and 80. That led to Iran falling from the number one destination to outside the top 20 for a good 20 years. They're coming back, but there's still, with the Iranian diaspora, there's certainly more opportunities for them to come if they're outside of Iran, but there's still a huge market inside of Iran, but they're still finding a way. They're not going to get back to where they were, but China is in a situation where there will always be opportunities to recruit there and to retain a good percentage of students in there if you're smart about it. If you're working with the right people in country and having in-country representation and presence, not just in person but digitally, is essential in China if you're going to have any traction beyond what you're already doing, to even maintain what you're already doing. In terms of numbers that you have. So you got to stop the slide, and you don't stop the slide by doing the same thing you've been doing when you haven't been investing anything. You buck up and you realize, hey, if this market's important to us, we're gonna be investing in maintaining that relationship and getting that presence where it needs to be, and having in-country representation that's reliable, and then we can talk to on a regular basis to get a sense of what's happening on the ground and adjust our strategy accordingly. So it does require flexibility, and that's not an easy thing to come by in higher education in the United States, just not. It's a reality of the beast. But there's hope, and you should never give up hope when there's still freedom of travel and ability to get messaging to those audiences that you're trying to reach. So the question is, will your institutions make that commitment to do so? So that's where we'll leave that question. How we should respond to Chinese students. Show them that you care, particularly your ones on campus. That's the bottom line for that one. Now, the final question will be a quick one, but how are U.S. universities making waves in international recruitment? And I'm bringing two very different examples up here, one of which is a story from Inside Higher Ed about Trine University in northeast Indiana. I've known some folks who've worked at Trine over the years, and they've always been a trier when it comes to international education. They've been committed to doing so. They realize that they're in a location that's not necessarily the most attractive in Angola, Indiana, and northeast Ohio, or northeast Indiana, where there's not a whole lot nearby. They have made inroads. While they do have a campus of some international students, they've really seen record growth through a very different strategy. They've opened up satellite campuses that are more for graduate education in Detroit, which is up Interstate 69 from where they are in Indiana, about an hour and a half or so, maybe 2 hours. And then also they've opened a campus in Phoenix, Arizona, of all places, so which has been a magnet for international students that might have already been maybe finishing their undergraduate in those markets and looking to continue on for a graduate degree. So they've seen success in thinking outside the box, and oftentimes that's what it takes to truly differentiate yourself out in the marketplace. Another school that's doing exactly that on a massive scale is Arizona State. I've had an opportunity to know the folks at Arizona State that have been responsible for a lot of the growth they've seen. One of my former colleagues from Destination Indiana, Holly Singh, he's been out at Arizona State running their international student and scholar services for a few years, and they have just been going gangbusters. Let's give you some numbers here. This is from Arizona. They now have in-person on-campus student body. They now have 140,000 undergraduate and graduate students. And that's an increase of almost 6,000 from this time last year. The highlights of that, for their campus locations, physical locations, almost 80,000 students are enrolled in ASU campuses, compared with 76,000 last year, 3.2% increase, so fairly modest. Online programs have increased 6.9% to 61,000. They have about 1,800 more graduate students, from 28,100 to 29,933 graduate students in on-campus and online degree programs. That's a 6.4% increase. International students in a combination of on-campus and online degree programs up 23.6% year over year, from 10,821 to 13,374. That's absolutely amazing. And that's on top of 1 in 3 students enrolled at ASU being first gen. So some staggering numbers there, but let's talk about the international students. Just the first year cohort, this is again first year freshman students enrolling this fall, 1,050 international students from 79 countries, an increase of 44% from a year ago. 44% increase year on year. How are they doing that? That's a conversation for another day, and we'll certainly dig into that and some of those reasons why. But they are everywhere. They have an extensive agent network. They travel. They have some incredible partnerships that are institutional partnerships that are working for them to bring cohorts to their institution. So you really see incredible growth. The international enrollment growth is down to, and here's Matt Lopez, who's the Associate Vice President of Academic Enterprise Enrollment and Executive Director of Admissions Services. ASU's reputation as a top global university has grown considerably around the world over the past year, particularly in India. Once international travel opened up this past year, members of our university leadership team and our faculty in business, design, and engineering programs travel abroad to continue to tell the ASU story. We also have admission staff living around the world, building relationships with schools, parents, and prospective students, and a number of virtual experiences for students who cannot travel to our campuses. This personal and technologically enabled approach is critically important, especially for families and students who make the decision to travel across the globe to achieve their academic and career goals. So amazing. And that's the kind of template, if you want to be a player internationally, a big player internationally, that is what it takes to see 44% growth year on year. They got out there this past year. They traveled, where most schools were just thinking about getting back out there, doing it slowly and moderately. They did a multi-level, multi-stage approach to how they were going to recruit, and it's paid off, clearly. And they're ahead of the curve that way. So congrats to ASU and my colleagues there, Chris Johnson on the undergrad recruitment and partnership side. Best of luck to you guys as you continue to be a leader for many of us in terms of growing your international population. So that's what I have for you this week on the Roundup. Appreciate you sticking with me. We look forward to sharing more news in the coming weeks on some of the hot topics of our field. So until next time, we wish you the very best and have a